Okay, so we should be recording. The good news is, starting today, things get more interesting, in my opinion. The beginning part of A&P1 is always kind of just a jumble of some seemingly unrelated business for introductory stuff. Then it goes into tissues, and the integumentary system is our first system, but it's not super exciting, in my opinion. So today we start the skeletal system, and from now on, if you take, obviously you're taking this course, and if you take A&P2, you will just continue to study the human body system by system by system. And I think it's more interesting because things become more relevant. We all know about our bones. We can touch them, feel them, even though they're under our skin. We've seen them. And it just becomes more relevant in our life as opposed to the cellular stuff and the tissue stuff. So that's the good news. The challenge is that almost all A&P books that I've ever read are organized in the same way. That means they start with the integumentary system, then it goes skeletal, muscular, nervous, respiratory, immune, endocrine, get sort of tossed in wherever, digestive, urinary, reproduction. That's because those things typically get more complicated. So even though things are going to get more interesting, they do get more complicated. So that's the challenge. But anyway, here we go. So I'm going to call it my first whiteboard. And we are talking about the skeletal system, obviously bones and osseous tissue. This is just language. Osseous just means bone. Ossification means the formation of bone. I'll reiterate all this language business as we go along through this chapter. I'm not going to cover a lot about the very first part of this chapter is just about skeletal cartilage. And you've been through that. You've been through the 3 types of cartilage. It's going to be on today's quiz: hyaline cartilage, elastic cartilage, and fibrocartilage. So I'm not going to talk a lot about that because you've been there. So I am going to start with bones, actually the skeletal system functions, just the main functions. This is introductory stuff. Most chapters start off with this. They give an overall sort of Reader's Digest view or a list of functions that particular system performed, just to let the student know how all-encompassing most of our organ systems are, much more than the layman understands. So I'm just going to list these words and say a few things about them. I'll try to go in the order of your book. Support. The whole reason that I assume you're probably sitting like I am right now, the whole reason we can sit upright or stand is due to our skeletal system. Our bones give us an internal framework for support, enabling us to stand or sit in conjunction, obviously, with skeletal muscles. Protection, that's pretty easy to understand. Just think about your skull, the cranial bones, providing protection for your central nervous system, your brain, or your rib cage, or it's technically called the thoracic cage, providing protection for your lungs and your heart. As you know, our abdominal cavity is not protected by the skeletal system very much, except for the vertebral column in the back, but protection is a big one. Movement. Without our bones or skeletal system, our skeletal muscles would have nothing to pull against so that we could move our limbs. So while these two are sort of linked up together, support and movement, it provides an internal framework as well as levers or levers for our skeletal systems to pull upon for movement. Most newbies forget about this one: mineral storage. Predominantly calcium and phosphate are stored in our bones. I'll say this again later. Calcium is the most used mineral in the human body. We don't make it, we have to ingest it, but we use it so much for almost all functions in the human body that we need a vast, vast supply. And so our bones are an area of stored calcium in the event that we don't have calcium readily available to ingest. Just to add on to the storage bit, there's other things that the bones, I'm just going to write lipid and growth factor storage as well. So our bones provide a place to store fat, believe it or not. We'll talk about that in a minute, as well as growth factors, which are just hormones. Bones, or the skeletal system, is the site of hematopoiesis. It's good that you learn this term now because you'll need it a lot in A&P too. Hematopoiesis just means blood cell formation or synthesis. And that occurs in red marrow found in spongy bone. Finally, hormone production. There is a hormone specifically called osteocalcin that helps regulate insulin secretion from the pancreas. So osteocalcin helps regulate blood sugar levels, as well as osteocalcin usually participates in bone formation as well. So that's a short list. It seems long to you, but it's actually a short list of the functions of the skeletal system. Now I'm going to go on to classification of bones. Actually, classification of the skeletal system is, that's no good, is a better description. We classify the skeletal system into two major divisions, and that is the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. The axial skeleton gets its name because it refers to the structures and the bones that are along basically the midline of the human body. So these are just anatomical divisions, not necessarily physiologic divisions, just anatomical divisions. So the axial skeleton would include the skull, think all the way down the middle of the human body, the vertebral column, that's supposed to be a U, the vertebral column, the thoracic cage, or what you and I call the rib cage. And then appendicular gets its name from appendages. So think of mostly arms and legs, but it also includes shoulders and hip joints as well. So I'm just going to write upper lower limbs. And if we were doing a live class, which I wish we were, and we were doing live labs, we would study these two things in different sections. So upper lower limbs, what's called the pectoral girdle, what you and I call the shoulders. And the pelvic girdles, what you and I call the hips. So that encompasses the appendicular skeleton. I'm going to layer over this and quickly go to classification of bones by shape. This is very easy, by the way. Some books, some A&P books, use 6 classification categories. Your book makes it easier and just classifies bones into one of 4 shape classifications. So I'm just going to list them. Long bones. The reason this is so easy is just based on what they look like. Okay, so bones that are long, you can just look at them, and if they're longer than they are wide, then it's considered a long bone. Classic examples would be the humerus. It's hard for me to write on this glass board. That's an H. The humerus, the femur, arms and leg bones in general. radius and ulna, tibia and fibula, and the lower leg. Also, our finger bones would be considered long bones as well. I'm not going to list all of the long bones in the human body. Number 2, short bones. These are things like, specifically, carpal bones. Those are wrist bones. Tarsals are ankle bones. And there are also sesamoid bones are typically fall within this category. We're not going to learn you're not going to have to learn a lot of sesamoid bones. Typically, those are found as little interlocking key bones in the cranium of the skull. The most obvious and common sesamoid bone that you would know would be the patella and the kneecap. So those are considered short bones. Examples of flat bones. You know some of these already. Things like the scapula, the shoulder blade, the sternum, what you might call the breastbone, that's the sternum, and the cranial, they're called cranial plates in the skull. Things like the frontal bone, the parietal bones, the occipital bone, they're all flat as well. And finally, the last category is pretty much anything that doesn't fall into category 1, 2, or 3. We call irregular bones. Some classic examples of these would be the vertebrae, they're kind of funky shaped with all of their spines coming off of them, and also the pelvic bones. The ilium, ischium, and pubis are considered irregularly shaped bones. Not going to spend any more time with this. This is just based on what they look like, an anatomical classification. I would like to spend some time on bone structure though. So let's layer over this and just go to bone. I'm trying to do as much as I can. I know you have a quiz today, so and by the way, I'll take any questions about that at the end of this. Bone structure, think of, first I'm just going to list tissue types. Remember, there are 2 major types of bone tissue in the human body. That's compact bone and spongy bone. So I'm going to call those back up just to your memory. Compact bone is the thick, hard stuff. I'm going to talk more about how it's arranged in detail later. But compact bone, just to remind you, is the hard, dense stuff that we find in the shaft of a long bone. The spongy bone are those little bone needles or spicules called trabeculi that have bone marrow in the spaces around those bone needles. So spongy bone has those struts called trabeculi, but it's usually encased in a thin layer of of compact bone. So I'm going to draw a picture speaks 1,000 words. So a flat bone. Sorry about my coughing. I have allergies. Flat bones are typically arranged in a sandwich form, anatomical sandwich called, this is just a French word, a diploe. That just means a sandwich of spongy bone wrapped in compact bone. So a flat bone typically looks like this. If we were to section a flat bone, slice it in half, open it up and look at it, there's a thin layer of compact bone surrounding spongy bone. So that's compact. And then in the center, so in your pelvis, for example, in your ilium, it looks like this. Inside then are these little, is spongy bone, which are these little tiny bone trabeculi, struts or needles. We also find this arrangement Other flat bones would be the scapula, the sternum, the cranial plates in the head and the skull. And just to remind you, I'll talk more about the specifics of how spongy bone is arranged in a minute, but there's red marrow. It's not just air spaces in here, there's red marrow. So that word diploid just refers to this sandwich type of anatomical form that flat bones take. So let me just label this really quickly. This would be spongy. That's a typical flat bone. A long bone, which I'm going to pull up a new whiteboard here just because it's going to be easier for me to label all the structures of a typical long bone. So I'm just going to draw a generic long bone, which most people use the humerus, the upper arm bone, as their example. And I left it thick in the shaft just on purpose so we could label everything. Here's how a typical long bone looks. It's all compact bone in the shaft. And that has a special scientific name, by the way, which I'll write. And then in the ends of the long bone, that compact bone gets really thin. It's thick in the shaft and then very thin on the ends. There's spongy bone in the ends of our long bones. And then in the center, in the shaft of the long bone, there is no spongy bone. There's a cavity that's filled with, well, in an infant, the cavity is filled with red marrow. In an adult like you and me, it's filled with yellow marrow. So this is compact bone, and it also surrounds this area out here as well. And then in the center of the ends is spongy. Now I'm going to use this typical long bone structure to identify all of the structures that you need to learn on a generic, especially on a long bone. First, the shaft of a typical long bone has a scientific name called the diaphysis. And I'm going to use this language both verbally when I talk for the rest of this unit, as well as on quizzes. The ends of a typical long bone are called the epiphysis. This just means the shaft. This just means the end. So on this bone, there are two epiphyses. And then this area between the diaphysis and epiphysis is called the metaphysis. This is just language. Don't worry. It's not hard to understand. You just have to learn a new language. All right, that's step one. And we know that in the diaphysis of a typical long bone, that's made up of all compact bone. The epiphyses are mostly spongy bone with a thin covering of compact bone. And just to remind you, there is hyaline cartilage, articular cartilage around the ends here, where they articulate with joints. We learned that in the cartilage unit. This center of the diaphysis, I'll use a different color, sorry. The center of the diaphysis is filled with, in an adult, yellow marrow, but the cavity itself has a name. So I'm just going to use a black pen. This cavity is called the medullary cavity. And in an adult like us, in a fully grown human, it's filled with yellow marrow. So I'm just going to color that in. Yellow marrow gets its name because it has a yellow cast. It's mostly adipose tissue, lipid. So it's a place for fat storage. And by the way, that is one of the last places our body goes for nutrition if we are actually starving to death. So the medullary cavity, I'm just going to put, is filled with yellow marrow. Remember, that's in a fully grown adult. In an infant, in a newborn, it's filled with red marrow. Red marrow is the site of blood cell synthesis. So a newly born infant needs much more blood cell production than an adult. Once we get fully grown, this converts, that medullary cavity storage area converts from red to yellow marrow. Red marrow in an adult does continue to exist in the epiphyses. So in you and I, this is where we make our blood cells, and also in the center of flat bones as well. So this is just learning the language. There is something now on the outside of a typical long bone. I'll try to draw it. You're looking at the inside now, but right in the metaphysis area, if you were to hold a bone in your hand, there is a scar or a line in the metaphysis area right here. You can see it on the outside of a long bone. That's called the epiphyseal line. And the epiphyseal line is just a scar or a remnant of where a growth plate existed when we were young. I'm going to talk to you and show you how a growth plate works probably next week. But when that growth plate seals up bone to bone, it creates this scar or line on the outside of the bone called the epiphyseal line. I'm going to put from, the scientific name of a growth plate is the epiphyseal plate. Now, I'm almost finished with this drawing. In life, so that's the bone. If you were to reach into a human that's living and rip out this humerus bone from their arm, it doesn't look all nice and white and clean like in lab when we look at bones. There's stuff all over that bone, living tissue. And one very prominent tissue is a coarse connective tissue that surrounds the diaphysis of the shaft, the diaphysis of a typical long bone. So that's what this green is supposed to represent. It's a coarse, dense connective tissue that sort of serves as a jacket to the diaphysis, and that's called the periosteum. P-E-R-I means around, and osteum means bone. So it's a coarse, dense connective tissue that surrounds, called the periosteum, that surrounds the diaphysis of a typical long bone. I'll talk about the functions of the periosteum later, soon. Well, I'm running out of different colors. There is a lining to the inside of the medullary cavity as well. I'm going to use blue, even though I use blue for this hyaline cartilage out here. I'm going to use blue. It's not cartilage, but I just ran out of different colors. There's a lining to the inside, just like this. A soup can has a lining to it, really thin, delicate lining of tissue. That's called endosteum. Endo means within, osteum means bone. So endosteum is a thin, delicate connective tissue, unlike periosteum, that lines the inside of the medullary cavity. So that gives you an idea of, I'm going to label one more thing. These little bone spicules are called trabeculi and spongy bone. Just get used to that word because I'm going to use it a lot. Those little needles or spicules. So that takes care of the basic bone anatomy that you need to know in order to get a really good head start on reading this chapter and understanding. Now I'm going to talk about some of these structures in detail. And the first one I'm going to choose to talk about is the periosteum. That's coarse, dense connective tissue that surrounds or wraps around the diaphysis of a typical long bone. It's not just wrapped around, it's actually physically embedded or connected to the bone itself. and it looks like this. I'll use the same colors. If this is periosteum, just magnifying what we looked at on our last screen, and here is the actual diaphysis of the bone. The periosteum, there are tiny connected collagen needles, collagen spikes that penetrate the bone surface that hold that periosteum tightly to the bone. So this would be periosteal tissue. Out here, this is actually bone tissue. And those little spikes or needles are called Sharpie's fibers. And they secure the periosteum to the bone tissue. They are made of collagen. So they're like collagen needles. It would be like if the shirt or jacket you are wearing right now had little tiny needles that penetrated your skin. So let's talk about some functions of this periosteum. There are osteogenic stem cells located underneath the surface in here. So kind of on the on top of the bone surface, but underneath the periosteal surface. I'm just going to write located under periosteum. And these stem cells give rise, don't worry, I'm gonna list all of the bone cell types found in bone, and this is gonna be one of them, but they're just stem cells that give rise to immature bone cells. But they're located here underneath the periosteum. Also the periosteum, these are functions I'm listing, is rich in vascularization. Really what that means is it provides a route of blood vessels to the bone itself. So if we have the main nutrient artery, it enters the periosteum and it also then enters the bone. And it can also branch. So the periosteum is rich in vascularization and also nerves. Really, it provides a route for blood vessels and nerves to enter the bone. And finally, the periosteum provides an anchoring surface for tendons and ligaments. Remember, tendons are connections of muscle to bone, and ligaments, it's that dense regular tissue, are connections of bone to bone. So that gives you a general idea of what the periosteum is and what it does. Now I'm just going to remind you really quickly, we're building a vocabulary here. The word hematopoiesis means blood cell production. Hematopoietic tissue refers to red marrow. So what really is red marrow? We know that it's the site of blood cell synthesis. That means that it is also the site of blood stem cells. When you take A&P2, you're going to study blood as an entire unit, and you'll go through the whole process of red blood cell formation, white blood cell formation, and platelet or thrombocyte formation. So I'm not going to get into the great details of that, but we just need to know what it is. It's found in the spaces of spongy bone. So that when I say red marrow, you know exactly what I mean. I mean all of this business. Next header, I'm going to write living cells in bone tissue. I'm going to list them and describe them. Since we already talked about these, I'm going to list them first. Osteogenic cells. Some books will say osteoprogenitor cells. That's the exact same thing. I don't know why they've gotten two different names, but I'll refer to them as osteogenic cells. But if you read or hear osteoprogenitor, that's the exact same thing. These are actively dividing. That means mitosis. They're stem cells. I'm just admitting new students here. So actively dividing cells, osteogenic cells, these stem cells are a type of living tissue, living cell found in bone tissue itself. There's going to be 5 of these altogether, but I'm going to say a few more things about these osteogenic cells. They are found, we know that they're found under the periosteum. So on sort of on the outside surface of a bone, as well as the endosteum on the inside of the medullary cavity. So they're found under the periosteum on the outside of the bone and under the endosteum in the medullary cavity on the inside of a bone. And here's what's going on. They are really squamous cells. That just means flat. The stem cells are squamous cells that divide, and they give rise to immature bone cells called osteoblasts. I'm going to list osteoblasts as a different type of cell. They give rise to osteoblasts and bone lining cells. So that takes care of osteogenic cells. Now I'm going to go on to cell number 2. And I'm going to try to go in the order of your book. Hopefully I'm doing that. I don't have my book in front of me. Osteoblasts. We know what this word means. Osteo means bone, blast means immature cell. So these are immature bone cells that arise from those osteogenic cells. Here's their function. They secrete new bone, that's an N, matrix. We know now that bone is a connective tissue, and they secrete new bone matrix, but it's called, that matrix is called osteoid. An osteoid is uncalcified. It might take you a little while to understand how new bone is formed. I'm going to go over it in detail more than once. But an osteoblast, here's an immature bone cell, an osteoblast. And it's a happy cell because it's almost the weekend. This thing secretes, this immature bone cell secretes this organic matrix. It's like a goo almost. And that's called osteoid. So it secretes this stuff. Then when that stuff mixes with calcium and phosphate and some other things as well, which are ingested in our diet and brought to a specific area by blood cells. So this stuff, the calcium and phosphate, are in our blood, and they're deposited in the same area that an osteoblast is making this osteoid. And when these things mix together, it hardens and forms new hard bone matrix, new bone tissue. So we say osteoblasts secrete new bone matrix. Technically, it's this organic stuff that's uncalcified, and it's only when calcium and other minerals mix with osteoid that it really gets this firm, hard, and brittle type of consistency to it. I'm just pausing to make sure that I have said everything I need to say about osteoblasts. Now here's the deal. An osteoblast is an immature bone cell, and it secretes this stuff. And when that stuff hardens and this osteoblast gets completely surrounded in new bone matrix or new bone tissue, it becomes what we call an osteocyte, a mature bone cell. It stops secreting. Once it gets surrounded in its hard bone matrix, it stops secreting osteoid and it becomes an osteocyte, which is a mature bone cell that its function is to maintain the matrix that was once secreted by the osteoblast. So osteocytes are just mature bone cells, and they now live in this pocket or this cavity that they've encased themselves in. These living cells live in cavities. Those have a name. They're called lacunae. That's plural. If we drop the E, lacuna, that's just singular. And what these osteocytes do is they communicate to osteoblasts and osteoclasts to help with bone remodeling. That will make more sense to you, that sentence, as we go on through this chapter. Just think right now, an osteocyte is a mature bone cell. It no longer secretes this stuff, and it maintains the matrix. It lives in this little pocket or cavity. So number 4, I'm going to write a bone. I mentioned this earlier. A bone lining cell is sort of like an osteocyte. Bone lining cells, though, are flat in shape. So they're flat cells that are found, that's a U, F-O-U-N-D, that are found on the surface of bones, specifically where bone remodeling is not going on or occurring. So they're basically bone maintenance cells as well, but they don't really have anything to do with regulating a bone remodeling. Remodeling means building new bone and degrading old bone tissue. So I'm going to write bone maintenance. They're also called periosteal cells and endosteal cells because they are found specifically under the periosteum and under the endosteum. So just think of them as help maintaining bone matrix and where they are found. I'm going to squeeze in number 5 so I don't have to call up a whole new board for this. The last major type of bone cell is an osteoclast, C-L-A-S-T, osteoclast. This is a special cell. It is derived from, osteoblasts are derived from osteogenic cells, those stem cells on the previous page. An osteocyte is just a grown-up osteoblast, so its derivation is also from osteogenic cells. Bone lining cells are also derived from osteogenic cells. These cells, osteoclasts, their derivation is somewhere else completely. They do not come from bone stem cells, osteogenic cells. They are derived from macrophages, which you've heard that word before. Those are non-specific immune cells. I know this sounds redundant, but Macrophages actually are derived from a type of white blood cell called a monocyte. So I'm going to put in parentheses, from monocytes. These cells, what they do is they dissolve bone matrix. So their function is they're really large multinucleate cells that secrete enzymes and acids that basically dissolve bone matrix. Why would our body want to dissolve bone tissue? Well, there's several reasons. We typically don't use what we don't need in the human body, meaning the body doesn't use it physiologically. So bone tissue will get degraded or dissolved or what you and I might call worn away. Really, that means osteoclast activity, where we're not actually using it. So we build new bone where we need it, and we dissolve or get rid of bone where we don't need it. That whole process of building and dissolving is called bone remodeling. I'll talk about more specifics of that later. It also, when we dissolve bone matrix by what these cells do, that also releases stored calcium from bone tissue. So if our blood level of calcium, that's where calcium is available, if that level, it's strictly monitored. If it drops, then chemical signals tell osteoclasts to dissolve bone tissue and unlock calcium from bone matrix and dump it into the blood where we can use it for other things. One of the last things I'm going to talk about today is the structure of compact bone. I'm going to write compact bone tissue structure. The only thing that we've said about compact bone so far is it's really hard and dense. We've also identified where it's located in the human body. It's predominantly located in the shaft diaphysis of long bones and thinly around flat bones or around the ends of bones. But what is actually in this tissue? So we're going to look at it with a microscope. So really quickly, if I take a typical long bone like this, we know that most of the compact bone is in the shaft or diaphysis of it. If I slice this bone right through here and I turn it on end, we'd have something that looks like this, because there's the medullary cavity in the middle, and this is all compact bone. That's what we're going to look at now under a microscope. So let me erase this really quickly. That's just to give you context reference of what you're looking at. Now I'm going to draw that really big. We're going to magnify this. So this is the center of the diaphysis, a cross section of a bone. Here's the medullary cavity. If it's an adult bone, that medullary cavity is filled with adipose tissue, called yellow marrow. It's a place for energy reserves or storage. We're concerned now with all of the stuff out here, this hard bone tissue. So that's what we're going to identify and look at. First and foremost, if we were to look at this under a microscope, we would see that this tissue, it's solid, but it grows. We would see these very faint circular patterns. I'm not drawing holes here. I'm drawing rings of hard tissue. And the reason is because this hard tissue grows in ring-like patterns. They're not perfect circles. That's why I'm purposely drawing them that way. So we see these very faint outlines of tissue. Each of these circular things that I'm drawing, structures, is one unit of compact bone growth, okay? And in the center of these is a hole or a cavity that runs parallel to the medullary cavity, but it's much smaller in diameter. Each of these rings is one unit of compact bone growth, and it's called an osteon. Now within an osteon, this hole in the center that runs parallel to the medullary cavity is called a central canal, also known as a haversian canal. So in the center of each osteon is a central canal. If you see this word, it's the same thing. And that canal contains not yellow marrow, but vessels and nerves. Arteries, veins, and nerves. It's hard for me to draw this on a two-dimensional surface, but there are perforating canals that come off of the central canal like this, that smaller arteries, veins, and nerves can branch into to reach further into the bone tissue. So, in other words, if a central canal looked like this running down through an osteon, the perforating canals would come off almost at right angles to that central canal like this. And smaller arteries and veins would run through the perforating canal. So I'm just going to label this. Now, I need to go to a new board. I won't erase this. I'm gonna enlarge one of these osteons, and I need more space. So this is not the whole bone. This is just an osteon, one unit of compact bone growth. There's this central canal in the center of it. This is all hard tissue out here, mostly bone matrix. But there are also living cells out here. So I'm going to draw these little cavities or caves that the living cells live in. And they grow in a circular pattern, like this, sort of around the central canal. And inside of each of one of these cavities is a living cell. And they would just keep growing in a circular pattern, like this. And there would be a cell in each of these. So I'm going to label this. This is actually an osteocyte. That's a mature bone cell in a, it's really hard for me to write with a plastic pen on a glass board. So in a lacuna, L-A-C-U-N-A. The lacuna is the name of the space or cavity that osteocyte lives in. So we've got big perforating canals coming off of this haversian canal, but then there are smaller canals as well that reach to these lacunae where the living cells are. So they're isolated to some degree. The living cells are isolated, but there are really tiny passageways called canaliculi that allow these cells to communicate with one another, as well as to communicate with arteries, vessels, and nerves. So you can see now that bone growth, compact bone growth within an osteon, sort of takes on the growth ring of a tree look when we look at it under a microscope. So this little tiny canal is called a canaliculi. That's plural. Canaliculus, US, would just mean one. So I'll label another one. So these are canaliculi. That's just Latin for small canal, tiny canal. And that allows for things like oxygen, CO2, and nutrients to get to and from the cells. A few more terms of this osteon. The bone matrix, the hard stuff out here, that's not supposed to be any structure. Just the white stuff in this diagram is hard bone matrix tissue that has calcified, but it grows in a circular ring type of pattern. Picture this. It's hard for me to draw this on a two-dimensional surface, but I always tell students, but hard bone tissue kind of grows like a candy cane, like a holiday candy cane, in that if this is the shaft of the bone, the pattern of hard bone tissue sort of grows in a spiral type of pattern, or in a circular but spiral motion if we go all the way down the bone. The circular pattern has a name to it. This word, lamellae, refers to the circular ring-like pattern of hard bone matrix. I write that out because I don't want you to get the word lamellae confused with lacuna or lacunae, because that is easily done. So lamellae are the circular ring patterns of hard bone matrix. The word interstitial lamellae is a word that I don't use a whole lot. That just means hard bone matrix between actual osteons. All right. I don't think I'm going to get into the structure of spongy bone or chemical composition of bone yet today. I know that you have a quiz, so I'm going to cut off our talk here. So let me just cut my recording, and then I'll open it up to any questions you have, okay?